Sometimes life surprises us in the most unexpected ways, reminding us that wonder still exists in this world. For anyone who has ever felt that connection with something greater than themselves, this story will touch your heart. Kael, an Apache warrior, was hunting the same desert trails his grandfather had taught him to walk. He had seen countless animals over the years, but nothing prepared him for what stepped out from behind the rocks that morning. The largest wolf he had ever laid eyes on stood before him, silver fur gleaming in the sunlight. Most animals would run. This one didn't. Instead, it looked directly into Kael's eyes, as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting. What happened next changed everything this warrior believed about his people's ancient connection to the land. What would you do if a wild creature looked at you like it was trying to tell you something important? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the red cliffs in shades of copper and gold, as Kael stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping his grandfather's bow. At 43, he had walked these desert paths for more than 3 decades. Yet today felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the ancient spirits his grandfather used to speak of were stirring in the shadows between the saguaro. Kael quote. S. fingers unconsciously moved to the worn leather pouch at his belt, his grandfather's medicine pouch, filled with sacred stones and herbs passed down through 5 generations of Apache hunters. Old Joaquin had given it to him the night before his death, whispering words that still echoed in Kael's memory. The land remembers, grandson. When the time comes, you'll know. That time had come 3 hours ago, when the largest wolf tracks he'd ever seen appeared in the soft sand near Widow's Creek. The prints were impossibly deep, impossibly wide, as if they belonged to a creature from the old stories rather than the modern world. But Kael was a practical man, trained by his grandfather to read the desert like others read books. These tracks were real, fresh, and heading toward the sacred places his people had avoided for generations. The reservation stretched. Out below him, a patchwork of modest homes and trailer parks, where his people lived between 2 worlds. Down there, his wife, Nayeli, would be preparing breakfast for their twin daughters before driving them to the government school in town. She worried about him, these long hunting trips that took him deeper into the desert than necessary. "You're searching for something that doesn't want to be found," she'd told him just yesterday, her dark eyes reflecting concerns she couldn't quite voice. Perhaps she was right. But Kael couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him, drawing him toward the hidden corners of their ancestral land. The reservation might be their legal home now, but these older places, the caves and springs and sacred sites, marked only in the memories of elders, these belonged to a different time, when the Apache moved freely across the vast desert and understood its secrets. His radio crackled with the voice of his hunting partner, David Crow Feather. "Anything yet, brother?" "Still tracking," Kael replied, though he didn't mention the strange sense of being watched that had followed him since dawn. The desert was never truly silent, but today it felt hushed, expectant. Even the ravens that usually called from the mesquite trees seemed to be holding their breath. Kael moved forward, following the massive paw prints across a stretch of broken shale. His grandfather's stories came back to him, tales of wolves that walked alongside. Apache warriors in the old days, creatures that were more than animal, bridges between the world of men and the realm of spirits. As a boy, Kael had loved these stories. As a man, he dismissed them as folklore, the romanticism of elders trying to make sense of a world that had changed too fast around them. But the tracks in the sand told a different story. No wolf in Arizona grew this large. No wolf left prints that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light, as if infused with some inner fire. The trail led him to a grove of ancient cottonwoods surrounding a natural spring, one of the few places in this part of the desert where water flowed year-round. Kael had been here countless times, but never had it felt so alive, so aware. The leaves whispered in a breeze he couldn't feel on his skin, and somewhere in the shadows between the trees, something massive moved with the fluid grace of running. Water Dot. That quote AS when he saw it. Dot the wolf emerged from behind the largest cottonwood, like a vision from his grandfather's stories. Silver-grey fur caught the dappled sunlight, and eyes the color of winter sky fixed on his with an intelligence that made Kael's breath catch in his throat. The creature stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, larger than any wolf that should exist in the modern world. Dot for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity. Man and wolf regarded each other across the space between legend and reality. Kael's hand moved instinctively toward his bow, then stopped. This was no ordinary predator. The wolf's gaze held recognition, as if it had been waiting for him specifically, as if their meeting was not chance, but destiny. The wolf took a step forward, then another, until only 10 feet separated them. Up close, Kael could see the silver threads in its coat that seemed to shimmer with their own light, could smell the wild scent of sage and juniper that clung to its fur. Most remarkably, he could feel the animal's calm intelligence, a presence both ancient and patient. "I know you," Kael whispered. Though he couldn't say why, Dot the wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice. And for a moment, Kael could have sworn he saw something almost human in those pale eyes, a flash of understanding, of shared purpose. Dot. Then, without warning, the magnificent creature turned and walked away, pausing at the edge of the clearing to look back over its shoulder. The message was clear. "Follow." Kael, S radio, crackled again. "Base to Kael, come in." He recognized the voice of Jonas Silverbird, the tribal council's secretary. "Go ahead, Jonas." "Elder Ayana wants to see you, says it's urgent." Kael glanced toward where the wolf had disappeared into the desert scrub. The animal was gone, but somehow he knew it would return. This was only the beginning of something larger than he could yet understand. "Tell her I'll be there within the hour," he said into the radio. As he gathered his gear and prepared to return to the reservation, Kael felt the weight of his grandfather's medicine pouch against his hip. The old man's words echoed in his memory. "Again, the land remembers, grandson. When the time comes, you'll know." The time, it seemed, had finally come. Walking back toward his truck, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Behind him, somewhere in the shadows of the cottonwoods, he heard the soft sound of padded feet following at a respectful distance. The wolf was already keeping watch over him, though he didn't understand why the desert held its secrets close. But this morning, one of them had chosen to reveal itself. And Kael Tahoma, grandson of hunters and keeper of old ways, was about to discover that some legends were more than stories. They were prophecies waiting to unfold. The tribal council building sat at the heart of the reservation like an old adobe fortress, its walls thick enough to keep out both desert heat and unwanted influences. Kael parked his dusty pickup beside the building and noticed several other vehicles already there, more than usual for a morning meeting. Whatever Elder Ayana wanted to discuss, others were involved. Inside, the council chamber held the familiar scent of sage and old wood. 6 tribal members sat in a circle, their faces grave with the weight of serious discussion. Elder Ayana, at 78 the oldest member of their community, held court from her traditional woven chair. Her clouded eyes found Kael the moment he entered, and he felt the familiar chill that came with her particular gift of seeing beyond the present moment. "Sit, Kael Tahoma," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades. "We have much to discuss." Kael took his place in the circle, noting the presence of David Crow Feather, Jonas Silverbird, and 3 other hunters he respected. But there was tension here, an undercurrent of disagreement that made the air heavy. "Tell us about the wolf," Ayana said without preamble. Kael felt his spine stiffen. He hadn't mentioned the wolf to anyone, hadn't even called it in over the radio. How did you— "The desert speaks to those who know how to listen," the old woman replied, "and some conversations travel faster than radio waves. David saw you following tracks this morning." "Unusual tracks," David nodded grimly. "Biggest wolf. Sign I've ever seen, Elder. Thought Kael was chasing shadows until I saw them myself." "Not shadows," Ayana said, her fingers working worry beads worn smooth by generations of her family. "Tell them what you know of the Wolf Guardians, Jonas." The secretary shifted uncomfortably. A younger man, educated off-reservation, Jonas represented the practical side of tribal governance. "With respect, Elder, those are old stories, legends from before the reservation period. Everything is legend until it stands before you," Ayana replied sharply. She reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that made Kael's breath catch. An eagle feather, its shaft carved with intricate symbols, its tip still sharp enough to draw blood. She held it toward him. "Your grandfather carried this when he was young, before the government schools took the old ways from so many of us. Before we forgot that the land and the animals were partners, not possessions." Kael accepted the feather with reverence, feeling its weight, not just physical but spiritual. The moment it touched his palm, images flashed through his mind. Apache warriors riding alongside massive wolves, battles fought to protect sacred places, ceremonies that bound human and animal spirits together. The stories speak of a time when our people shared the desert with wolf guardians, Ayana continued, spirits in wolf form who protected the sacred sites, who chose human partners from among the strongest warriors. The bond was deeper than friendship. It was a joining of souls. But those stories, Jonas began, are being lived again. Ayana cut him off. "The wolf found you, didn't it, Kael? Not the other way around." Kael nodded slowly, remembering those intelligent, pale eyes, the sense of recognition that had passed between them. "It was waiting for me. I'm certain of it." "Because it was," the elder said, "just as your grandfather's grandfather once waited in this same desert for his wolf guardian to find him. The old contracts are being renewed, Kael. The question is whether you have the courage to honor them." David leaned forward. "What kind of contracts?" Ayana's weathered hands gestured toward the walls of the council chamber, where old photographs showed Apache chiefs and warriors from the 19th century. "Our ancestors knew that some places in this desert were sacred beyond human understanding. The wolf guardians protected these sites, and in return, they were protected by Apache warriors. When the government confined us to the reservation, many thought the old agreements were broken." "They weren't," Kael said, surprised by his own certainty. "They were just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Jonas demanded. "For the right time," Ayana replied. "For the right threat. For the right warrior." Her clouded eyes fixed on Kael with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me about your dreams, grandson." Kael felt heat rise in his cheeks. For 3 nights running, his sleep had been filled with vivid images. Wolves running through moonlit canyons, ancient ceremonies around sacred fires, voices speaking in the old language his grandfather had taught him. He told no one, not even Naili. "You've seen them too," Ayana said, reading his expression. "The ancestors are calling. The wolf spirits are awakening. Something is coming that will require the old protections." Jonas stood abruptly. "Elder, with all respect, we can't base tribal decisions on dreams and wolf sightings. We have real problems. Budget, shortfalls, disputes with the county government, development pressures on our borders. And you think those aren't connected?" Ayana's voice carried an edge of steel. "You think the encroachment on our lands is separate from the awakening of our guardians? Open your eyes, Jonas Silverbird. The old ways and the new challenges are part of the same story." Kael thought about the wolf's behavior, the way it had looked at him, as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What do you want me to do, Elder?" "What your blood calls you to do," she replied. "Follow the wolf. Learn what it needs to show you, but be warned, once you begin this path, there may be no returning to the life you've known." And if I refuse? Ayana's expression grew sad. Then we lose something precious that can never be recovered. The sacred sites will remain unprotected. The old knowledge will die with my generation, and your dreams will become nightmares. The meeting dissolved into quiet discussion, some members expressing skepticism, others sharing their own strange experiences from recent weeks, unusual animal behavior, dreams of wolves, the sense that something was shifting in the spiritual landscape of their homeland. As the group prepared to leave, Ayana caught Kael's arm. Your grandfather told me once that the wolf guardians choose their human partners not for their strength alone, but for their willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. The path ahead will test every belief you hold about what's possible. Kael fingered the eagle feather she'd given him, feeling its power like a small current of electricity. How do I find the wolf again? You don't, Ayana smiled. It finds you, but I suspect that won't take long. Walking to his truck, Kael noticed storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, despite the morning's clear skies. The desert air carried the scent of rain and sage, and somewhere in the distance, he could have sworn he heard the sound of howling, low, mournful, and calling him home. 3 days passed before Kael saw the wolf again. He'd returned to the cottonwood grove each morning, but found only silence and the lingering scent of sage. On the 4th day, as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the magnificent creature materialized from the desert shadows like morning mist taking solid form. This time, the wolf didn't wait. It turned immediately and began walking toward the red cliffs that marked the eastern boundary of traditional Apache territory. Kael followed, his grandfather's bow slung across his shoulder and the eagle feather secured safely in his shirt pocket. The wolf led him through country he'd never explored, not because it was forbidden, but because it had always felt separate, older, touched by something that made even experienced hunters uncomfortable. Here, the rock formations took on shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if ancient hands had carved meaning into the sandstone itself. After 2 hours of walking, the wolf stopped before what appeared to be a solid cliff face. But as Kael approached, he noticed a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, a crack in the rock that would be invisible to anyone not standing directly in front of it. The wolf looked at him expectantly, then squeezed through the opening and disappeared into darkness. Kael hesitated only a moment before following. The passage was tight, forcing him to turn sideways and shuffle forward in complete blackness. The walls pressed close on both sides, and the air smelled of deep earth and old secrets. Just when claustrophobia began to edge into his thoughts, the passage opened into a cavern that took his breath away. Light filtered down from cracks in the ceiling, illuminating walls covered with ancient paintings that seemed to glow with inner fire. The artwork was unmistakably Apache in style, but older than anything he'd seen in museums, old enough to belong to the time before European contact, before the reservation system, before his people's traditional life had been forever changed. The paintings depicted scenes that made his heart race with recognition. Apache warriors rode beside wolves the size of horses. Ceremonies showed humans and wolves standing together in circles of power. Hunting scenes revealed a partnership between species that went far deeper than mere companionship. These were spiritual bonds, sacred alliances that connected the human world with the realm of animal spirits. The wolf, he found himself thinking of it as Kiyu, though he couldn't say where the name came from, moved through the cave with familiarity, leading him deeper into the chamber. The paintings became more elaborate as they went, showing not just partnerships but transformations. Warriors who took on wolf characteristics, wolves who displayed human intelligence and wisdom. At the far end of the cave, Kael discovered what made this place truly sacred. A natural altar of red stone held objects that shouldn't have survived centuries in the desert. pottery vessels still containing sacred paints, tools carved from stone and bone, and bundles wrapped in hide that had somehow remained intact despite the passage of time. But it was the wall above the altar that stopped him cold. Here, the paintings told a story that seemed to mirror his own experience. An Apache warrior encountered a great silver wolf in the desert. The two formed a bond that led them to hidden places, sacred sites that required protection. The warrior learned to communicate with wolf spirits, to understand the language of the land itself. And there, in the final panel, the warrior and his wolf guardian stood before what could only be this very cave, their hands and paws raised toward symbols that seemed to dance with light in the filtered sunbeams. Kael approached the painted wall, his fingers tracing the outline of the ancient warrior's face. The features were different, but something in the stance, the expression, the relationship with the wolf companion. It was like looking in a mirror that reflected across generations. "You brought me here to show me this," he said aloud, turning to Kael. The wolf's pale eyes seemed to nod, and for a moment Kael could have sworn he heard a voice speaking in the old language his grandfather had taught him. "The circle continues, grandson of hunters. What was begun long ago awaits completion." Examining the cave more carefully, Kael began to understand that this wasn't just a gallery of ancient art, it was a repository of knowledge. The paintings weren't random decorations, but a systematic record of the relationship between Apache people and wolf guardians. Each panel built upon the previous one, creating a manual for sacred partnership that had been preserved for generations. One section showed the locations of other sacred sites throughout Apache territory. Another depicted the ceremonies required to strengthen the bond between human and wolf spirit. A third revealed the signs that would indicate when the guardians were needed most: drought, invasion by enemies, threats to the sacred places themselves. As afternoon light shifted through the cave's opening, new details emerged from the paintings. Kael discovered symbols he recognized from his grandfather's teachings, marking this place as one of the most sacred sites in all of Apache land. But there were other symbols too, ones that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his comprehension. Kael moved to a section of the cave wall that appeared blank at first glance, but as Kael joined the wolf, he noticed faint markings almost invisible in the stone, lines and symbols that formed what could only be a map. The map showed the locations of sacred sites across hundreds of miles of desert, connected by lines that suggested spiritual pathways known only to the initiated. Kael spent hours studying the cave paintings, committing their details to memory. As the sun began to set outside, painting the cavern walls in shades of deep red and gold, he understood that his life had been fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about encountering an unusual wolf. It was about accepting a role that stretched back through generations of his people. When it came time to leave, Kael hesitated at the cave entrance. Part of him wanted to stay, to continue studying the ancient knowledge preserved in this hidden place. But Kael was already waiting outside, and something in the wolf's manner suggested urgency. There were other places to see, other lessons to learn. As they made their way back through the darkening desert, Kael reflected on what he'd discovered. The paintings confirmed Elder Ayana's stories about wolf guardians, but they revealed something more, a system of spiritual protection that had safeguarded Apache sacred sites for centuries. And now, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, that system was awakening after generations of dormancy. The question that haunted him as he walked through the night was simple but profound. If the wolf guardians were returning, what threat had awakened them? What danger to the sacred places required protection so ancient and powerful that the spirits themselves had chosen to intervene? Behind him, Kael's pale eyes reflected the starlight, watching and waiting with the patience of creatures who measured time not in days or years, but in the turning of ages. Kael returned to the cave 3 times before he found the courage to venture into its deepest chamber. Each visit revealed new details in the ancient paintings, but something had prevented him from exploring the narrow passage that led away from the main cavern, until Kael made it clear that his education was incomplete. On this 4th visit, the wolf walked directly to the hidden passage and waited. The opening was so narrow that Kael had to remove his backpack and crawl on hands and knees, following the pale glow of Kael's fur through absolute darkness. The passage twisted and descended for what felt like miles before opening into a circular chamber that made him gasp with wonder. This inner sanctum was smaller than the main cave, but infinitely more sacred. The walls here weren't painted. They were carved with symbols that seemed to move in the light of the crystals embedded in the ceiling. Natural formations of quartz and other minerals created a soft luminescence that turned the chamber into a temple of living light. At the center of the chamber, on a pedestal of natural stone, lay what had drawn him here, a map unlike anything he'd ever seen, created on treated hide that had somehow remained supple despite its obvious age. The map showed the entire American Southwest in detail that rivaled modern cartography. But this wasn't just a geographical record. It was a spiritual document that revealed the sacred landscape hidden beneath the physical world. The map marked dozens of sites throughout Apache territory, each location connected to others by lines that formed a complex geometric pattern. Some sites were marked with wolf symbols, others with eagles, bears, or symbols Kael didn't recognize. But the wolf sites formed their own network, a separate system of spiritual protection that covered the most sacred places of his people. Kael approached the map with reverence, placing one massive paw gently on its surface. Where the wolf touched the hide, symbols began to glow with soft silver light, revealing layers of information invisible to the naked eye. Under Kael's influence, the map became 3-dimensional, showing not just locations, but the spiritual energy that flowed between sacred sites. "You're showing me the network," Kael breathed, understanding flooding through him. The Wolf Guardians don't just protect individual places, they maintain the connections between all the sacred sites. As if responding to his words, more symbols appeared on the map. These showed the current state of the network, and what Kael saw filled him with dread. Many of the connection lines had faded to mere shadows. Several Wolf Guardian sites showed no energy at all, as if the spiritual protections there had gone dormant or been destroyed entirely. But most disturbing were the new markings that appeared in red, symbols that clearly indicated threat, invasion, corruption of the sacred places. These red marks clustered around several areas, and Kael recognized the locations with growing alarm. They were sites currently under pressure from development, mining operations, and other forms of modern encroachment. "The network is failing," he said aloud, and Kael's low whine confirmed his interpretation. "That's why you awakened. That's why you found me." The wolf moved to another section of the map, this one showing prophecies written in the old Apache script his grandfather had taught him. As Kael studied the ancient words, their meaning became clear. When the sacred places cry out in pain, the wolf guardians will return. When the old protections fail, new guardians must be chosen. When the balance breaks, those who carry the blood of the first partnerships must restore what was lost. Kael's hands shook as he read further. The prophecy spoke of a warrior who would be called to renew the ancient contracts, to travel the network of sacred sites and reawaken the dormant protections. This warrior would face opposition from his own people, who had forgotten the old ways, and from outsiders who sought to exploit what they didn't understand. The blood of the first. "In partnerships," Kael murmured, thinking of his grandfather's stories about their family line. Old Joaquin had always insisted that their ancestors were among the original Wolf Guardian partnerships, but Kael had assumed this was family pride rather than literal truth. Now, studying the glowing map with Kael beside him, He understood that. His grandfather had been preparing him for this moment his entire life. Every hunting lesson, every story about reading the land, every ceremony he'd been taught to respect, all of it had been training for a role he was only now beginning to comprehend. The map showed the route he would need to travel. Connecting. The Wolf Guardian's sites in a specific sequence that would restore the network's power. Some locations were familiar, places he'd hunted or camped over the years. Others were in remote areas he'd never seen, requiring journeys of days or weeks through the harshest parts of the desert. As he studied the route, Kael noticed something that made his blood run cold. Several of the red threat markers corresponded to locations where he knew development projects were planned. Strip mining operations, resort developments, even a proposed highway that would cut directly through sacred territory. The timing couldn't be coincidental. "Someone knows," he said. To Kael, "Someone understands what these places are and wants to destroy the network deliberately." The wolf's growl was soft, but filled with ancient anger. Images flashed through Kael's mind, not his own memories, but visions shared by his guardian. He saw men in expensive suits studying maps similar to this one, saw sacred sites being surveyed by crews who had no idea what they were measuring, saw the systematic planning of an assault on everything his people held holy. The prophecy's warnings about opposition from within his own tribe suddenly made sense. If outside forces were planning to exploit the sacred sites, they would need cooperation from tribal members, people who could provide access, legal cover, or simply silence about what was really being destroyed. Kael carefully rolled up the ancient map, knowing he was taking responsibility for something beyond price. As he prepared to leave the chamber, Kael led him to one final revelation. A cache of items left by previous guardians. Carved wolf fetishes, bottles of sacred paint, tools for ceremonies he was only beginning to understand. Among these items was a journal written in English, left by what must have been the last guardian to walk this path. The final entry, dated nearly a century ago, read, "The old protections are failing, the network grows weak. I have done what I can, but the time of the Wolf Guardians is ending. Perhaps future generations will prove wiser than we have been. Perhaps they will remember what we are forgetting." Kael closed the journal with new resolve. The time of the Wolf Guardians wasn't ending. It was beginning again, and he, willing or not, had been chosen to restore what his ancestors had built. And his generation had forgotten. Outside the cave, dawn was breaking over the desert, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. But Kael knew that hope would have to be fought for, earned through trials that would test everything he believed about courage, loyalty, and the price of protecting what was sacred. The first sacred site on the ancient map lay 30 miles southeast of the cave, in country so remote that even experienced Apache hunters rarely ventured there. Kael set out before dawn, carrying enough water for 3 days and following Kael, across terrain that seemed to shift between familiar desert and something far older, more primal. The wolf moved with purpose now. No longer the patient teacher, but an urgent guide leading him towards something that couldn't wait. As they walked, Kael noticed changes in the landscape that shouldn't have been possible. Plants grew in configurations that suggested sacred geometry. Rock formations aligned in ways that created natural amplifiers for sound and light. Even the wind seemed to follow patterns that spoke of intelligence behind the seemingly random forces of nature. By midday, they reached a plateau overlooking a hidden valley that didn't appear on any modern map. The valley floor was covered with ruins, not the typical remains of ancient settlements, but something more deliberate and mysterious. Stone circles, carved monoliths, and geometric patterns that stretched across acres of desert formed a complex that rivaled anything Kael had seen in photographs of sacred sites around the world. At the center of the complex stood a single pillar of black stone, perfectly smooth and nearly 20 feet tall. As they descended into the valley, Kael felt the hair on his arms rise with an energy that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. This was one of the network nodes shown on the ancient map, a place where spiritual energy converged and was amplified across the entire system. Kael led him directly to the base of the pillar, where a circle of smaller stones surrounded the monolith. Each of these stones bore carved symbols, and as Kael studied them, he realized they corresponded to other sites on the network. The entire complex was designed as a spiritual communication system, allowing guardians at different locations to coordinate their protection of the sacred places. But something was wrong. The stones that should have been warm with spiritual energy felt cold and lifeless. The carvings that should have glowed with inner light were dark and silent. This node of the network had gone dormant, cutting off communication with other guardian sites and leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Kael approached the central pillar, remembering instructions from the ancient journal. Previous guardians had left detailed accounts of the ceremonies required to reawaken dormant sites, though they'd warned that the rituals were dangerous for anyone not properly prepared. Without the right spiritual protections, attempting to reactivate a node could kill the guardian or drive them mad. With the sudden influx of spiritual energy, as he placed his hands on the black stone, Kael felt a shock of connection that nearly knocked him backward. Images flooded his mind, centuries of guardians who had stood in this same place, their hands on this same stone, their spirits joined with the wolf companions at their sides. He saw the network in its full glory, lines of power connecting dozens of sacred sites across the southwest, forming a web of protection that had safeguarded Apache lands for generations beyond counting. But he also saw the network's decline. One by one, guardian sites had gone dark as the old knowledge was lost, as sacred places were destroyed or defiled, as his people were forced onto reservations and forbidden to practice the ceremonies that maintained the spiritual protections. The pillar grew warm under his touch, responding to the presence of someone with the blood and training to serve as a guardian. But awakening it fully would require more than just contact. It would require the complete ceremony, performed with a wolf guardian at his side and the proper offerings to the spirits who maintained the network. Kael stepped back, studying the arrangement of stones around the pillar. The positions matched descriptions in the ancient journal, but several of the smaller stones had been moved or damaged over the decades of abandonment. Before the site could be reactivated, the sacred geometry would need to be restored. Working throughout the afternoon, with Kael watching and occasionally guiding him toward correct positions, Kael carefully repositioned the stones according to the ancient patterns. Each stone was heavier than it appeared, as if it contained something denser than mere rock. As he worked, he began to understand that these weren't just markers. They were reservoirs of spiritual energy, carefully positioned to create specific flows of power that would connect this site with others across the network. As the sun began to set, Kael completed the restoration of the stone circle. The moment the final stone clicked into place, the entire complex came alive with subtle energy. The carvings on the pillar began to glow with soft silver light, and the smaller stones hummed with harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. But the true test came when he reached into his pack and withdrew one of the carved wolf fetishes from the guardian cache. Following instructions from the journal, he placed the fetish at the base of the central pillar and spoke the words his grandfather had taught him, prayers in the old language that called upon the spirits of land and sky to witness the renewal of ancient contracts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Light blazed from the pillar, visible even in the gathering dusk. The entire valley filled with a sound like singing, as if the stones themselves were voicing their joy at being awakened after decades of silence. And in that light, in that sound, Kael felt the presence of every guardian who had ever stood in this place, their spirits adding their strength to his own. At his side, Kael underwent a transformation that left Kael speechless. the wolf's silver. Fur began to glow with inner light, and his already impressive size seemed to increase until he stood nearly as tall as a horse. Most remarkably, when Kael looked at him now, Kael could hear the wolf's thoughts as clearly as spoken words. The first node awakens. Kael's voice resonated in his mind, carrying with it the weight of centuries. The network stirs. But we are only beginning, Guardian. The path ahead will test every strength you possess. As full darkness fell over the desert, the awakened sight continued to pulse with light that could be seen for miles. Kael realized that their work here had announced their presence to anyone watching the sacred sites. From now on, they would be hunted by those who wanted to prevent the network's restoration. But they had also announced their presence to other guardians, other sites in the network that had been waiting for this moment. In the distance, Kael could see answering lights beginning to flicker, other nodes responding to the call, other sacred places stirring to life after generations of dormancy. The ancient map had shown him the route he needed to follow, but now he understood the urgency behind it. Each site they awakened would make the next easier to restore, but it would also make them more visible to their enemies. They were in a race against time, against forces that had been working for decades to ensure the Guardian network would never function again. As Kael prepared to make camp for the night, he found a smooth stone at the base of the pillar that hadn't been there before. A spirit stone, warm to the touch and pulsing with gentle energy. The moment he picked it up, he felt its power, guidance. Through the desert, protection from spiritual attacks and, most importantly, confirmation that he was on the right path. Kael settled beside the fire Kael built, his enhanced form still glowing softly in the darkness. Tomorrow we travel to the next site, the wolf's voice spoke in his mind. But tonight, you must dream the dreams of guardians. The ancestors have much to teach you before the real trials begin. The dreams came as Kael had promised, but they were unlike anything Kael had ever experienced. In his sleep, he walked alongside Apache warriors from centuries past, their wolf companions padding silently through landscapes that shifted between the familiar desert and realms that existed beyond the physical world. The ancestors spoke to him in the old language, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through bloodlines rather than books. He learned the true names of power, words that could call rain from cloudless skies, or still the wind with a whisper. He witnessed ceremonies that bound human spirits to animal guardians, creating partnerships that transcended individual lifetimes. Most importantly, he saw the network of sacred sites as it had once functioned, a web of spiritual protection that had kept Apache lands safe from enemies both human and supernatural for countless generations. When dawn broke over the hidden valley, Kael woke with knowledge he hadn't possessed before. The spirit stone at his belt pulsed with warm recognition, and he understood that the ancestors had used his dreams to download centuries of guardian training directly into his consciousness. What should have taken years to learn had been compressed into a single night of sacred dreaming. Kael stood waiting at the edge of their camp, his magnificent form outlined against the morning sky. "The second sight calls to us," the wolf's voice resonated in Kael's mind, "but we will not travel alone." As if summoned by his words, other wolves began emerging from the desert scrub around the valley. Not physical animals, but spirit wolves, guardians, who had awakened in response to the network's restoration. Each was as large as Kael, their coats shimmering with colors that existed nowhere in the natural world. Deep gold, silver white, midnight blue, shot through with starlight. "The pack gathers," Kael explained as the spirit wolves took positions around them. "Each sacred site we awaken calls its guardian back to service. They will travel with us now, adding their strength to ours." The second site lay 40 miles northeast, in a region that had once been the heart of Apache territory, but was now threatened by the largest development project in the state's history. Navarro Industries had purchased thousands of acres for a resort and casino complex that would bring jobs to the region and destroy one of the most sacred places in all of Apache land. As they traveled, Kael began to understand the scope of the conspiracy they faced. The development wasn't random or purely commercial. Someone had studied the ancient maps, identified the most important nodes in the Guardian network, and systematically targeted them for destruction. The timing of multiple projects all threatening sacred sites simultaneously couldn't be coincidental. The spirit wolves ranged ahead and behind their small group, invisible to normal sight but clearly visible to Kael's enhanced perceptions. They moved with purpose and intelligence, scouting for dangers both physical and spiritual. Through his bond with Kael, Kael could sense their reports. Men with machines were already working at the second site, digging foundations for buildings that would poison the spiritual energy of the place. They crested a ridge overlooking the sacred site, just as the sun reached its zenith. Below them stretched a scene that filled Kael with rage and despair. Ancient burial grounds had been torn open by bulldozers. Sacred springs had been diverted to feed artificial lakes for the planned resort. Most devastating of all, the central shrine, a natural formation of red stone that had served as an altar for countless generations, had been dynamited to make room for a parking structure. They knew, Kael whispered, his hands clenching into fists. They knew exactly what they were destroying. Through Kael's enhanced senses, he could perceive the spiritual damage more clearly. The node that should have been a brilliant beacon of power was now a wound in the fabric of the sacred landscape, bleeding energy that disrupted the entire network. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was a deliberate assault on the spiritual infrastructure that protected Apache lands. But as they descended toward the ruined site, Kael discovered something the destroyers hadn't anticipated. Hidden beneath the obvious sacred markers was an older shrine, one so ancient that its existence had been forgotten by all but the deepest tribal memories. The spirit wolves led him to a crevice between two standing stones, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Inside the hidden chamber, Kael found what he was looking for, an ancestral war shield, its surface decorated with symbols that made his blood sing with recognition. Wolves and eagles danced around its rim, and at its center was the image of a warrior standing beside a spirit wolf, both surrounded by flames that represented the spiritual energy they commanded together. The moment Kael touched the shield, visions flooded his consciousness. He saw the ancient alliance between Apache warriors and wolf spirits, witnessed battles where human and animal fought side by side against enemies that threatened the sacred places. The shield had belonged to the first wolf guardian, the legendary warrior who had established the network of sacred sites and bound his bloodline to their protection. As he lifted the shield from its resting place, Kael felt its power merge with his own spiritual energy. The spirit stone at his belt blazed with light, and suddenly he could perceive the network as never before. Despite the damage to this site, the deeper connections remained intact. The spiritual pathways between sacred places had been weakened, but not severed. The network can be healed, he said aloud, and the spirit wolves around him howled with joy at his understanding. But their celebration was short-lived. From the construction site above came the sound of engines and shouting voices. Someone had spotted the light emanating from the hidden chamber. Within minutes, they would be surrounded by security guards and construction workers, people who would see only trespassers on private property, not guardians trying to heal a wounded sacred place. Kael's voice was urgent in his mind. We must leave now. The healing will take time, and we cannot be captured before the work is complete. As they prepared to retreat, Kael saw vehicles racing toward their position, not just security guards, but men in military fatigues carrying weapons that looked far too sophisticated for construction site protection. Whatever forces were behind the destruction of the sacred sites, they had been expecting opposition and were prepared to deal with it violently. The spirit wolves formed a protective circle around Kael and Kiyu as they climbed back toward the ridge. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed across the desert as their pursuers discovered the empty chamber. But the real battle was just beginning, and Kael knew that from now on they would be hunted by enemies who understood far more about the sacred sites than they had initially realized. The ancestral war shield felt solid and reassuring on his arm, its power adding to his own growing abilities. But as they disappeared into the vast desert, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap that had been generations in the making. The pursuit lasted 3 days, across some of the harshest terrain in the southwest. Kael and Kiyu, accompanied by their pack of spirit wolves, stayed ahead of their hunters through a combination of ancient knowledge and supernatural guidance. But their enemies were well equipped and determined, using helicopters, tracking dogs, and technology that seemed designed specifically to hunt people trying to hide in the desert. On the 4th morning, exhausted and running low on water, they reached the final site marked on the ancient map, a natural amphitheater hidden deep in a canyon system that didn't appear on any government survey. As they descended into the canyon, Kael felt the spiritual energy of the place like a physical presence, stronger than anything they'd encountered at the previous sites. The canyon walls were covered with petroglyphs that told the complete story of the Wolf Guardian tradition, from its origins in the earliest days of Apache civilization through prophecies that spoke of its eventual renewal. But at the center of the amphitheater stood something that took Kael's breath away, a perfect stone tablet, 10 feet tall and carved with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the changing light. The prophecy stone, Kiyu's voice whispered. In his mind, with reverence, the source of all guardian knowledge. Touch it, and you will understand everything. Kael approached the tablet carefully, aware that he was in the presence of something sacred beyond measure. The spirit stone at his belt grew warm, then hot, then began to emit light that matched the glow emanating from the carved symbols. As he placed his hands on the prophecy stone, the world around him dissolved into visions that revealed truths he hadn't suspected. He saw the creation of the Guardian Network, not just as a system of spiritual protection, but as a response to an ancient threat that came from beyond the human world. Long before Europeans arrived in the Americas, something had been trying to corrupt the sacred places, to turn them into sources of destructive power rather than protection. The Wolf Guardians had been established not just to preserve Apache traditions, but to defend reality itself against forces that sought to unmake the natural order. The prophecy was written in layers, revealing different meanings to Guardians at different stages of their development. At its deepest level, it spoke of a time when the ancient enemy would return in new forms, using human agents to destroy the sacred sites and break the protective barriers that kept darker powers at bay. "The land cries out," Kael read aloud as the symbols blazed with meaning. "The sacred places bleed, the old protections fail, and the enemy prepares to claim what was never theirs to take. In this darkest hour, the Wolf Guardian shall return, bearing the blood of the first partnerships, carrying the fire of the ancestors, wielding the shield of the earth itself." But as he continued reading, Kael discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The prophecy didn't speak of victory as inevitable. Instead, it warned that the final battle would require a sacrifice beyond imagination. The Guardian would need to merge permanently with the spirit realm, giving up his human life to become a bridge between worlds, an eternal protector of the sacred places. "You knew," he said to Kiyu, understanding flooding through him. "You knew what this would cost." The great wolf's mental voice carried infinite sadness. "All Guardians must choose when the time comes. But the choice is always yours to make. Kael Tahoma. No prophecy can force a heart that will not be willing." Before he could respond, the sound of helicopters echoed through the canyon. Their pursuers had found them at last, And from the noise, there were more of them than ever. But as Kael looked up at the aircraft circling overhead, he realized these weren't just security forces or even military units. The helicopters bore no markings, and the men rappelling down into the canyon moved with a precision that spoke of supernatural coordination. "They're not entirely human anymore," Kael growled, his form growing larger and more wolf-like as he prepared for battle. "The enemy has been changing them, preparing them for this moment." The spirit wolves materialized around the prophecy stone, their forms becoming more solid and menacing as the threat increased. Kael raised the ancestral war shield, feeling its power merge with his own enhanced abilities. But even as he prepared to fight, he continued studying the prophecy stone, desperate to understand what weapons might be available to them. That quote S, when he discovered the final revelation, the one that changed everything he thought he knew about their situation. Hidden within the most ancient symbols was the truth about Navarro Industries and the conspiracy to destroy the sacred sites. The company wasn't just a development corporation. It was a front for something far older and more dangerous, an organization that had been working for centuries to weaken the spiritual defenses of the Americas. The man behind it all wasn't just a greedy businessman, but a descendant of the first European colonizers who had tried to destroy Apache spiritual traditions. His family had been fighting a secret war against the Guardian network for generations, passing down knowledge and hatred from father to son, waiting for the right moment to complete their ancestors' work. But they had made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to destroy the sacred sites, they had awakened the very forces they sought to eliminate. The network wasn't just defensive, it was designed to fight back when threatened. And now, with 3 sites reactivated and the prophecy stone revealing its secrets, the full power of the Guardian tradition was awakening after centuries of dormancy. As the enemy forces closed in around them, Kael felt the prophecy stone pulse with power that seemed to flow directly into his body. The shield on his arm blazed with protective energy, and suddenly he could see the spiritual forms of his enemies as clearly as their physical bodies. They weren't just corrupted humans, they were possessed by entities that had no business existing. In the natural world, the final battle begins. Kael's voice carried both warning and promise. "But remember, Guardian, we fight not just for victory, but for the right of the sacred places to exist in a world that has forgotten their importance." The prophecy stone continued to reveal its secrets, even as gunfire erupted around them. And in those final moments before combat was joined, Kael understood that he was fighting not just for his people, or even for the sacred sites themselves, but for the spiritual integrity of the entire American Southwest. The Wolf Guardians weren't just protectors. They were the last line of defense against forces that would turn the entire region into a spiritual wasteland. The battle in the canyon was brief but decisive. Kael's growing powers, combined with the protection of the spirit wolves and the energy radiating from the prophecy stone, proved more than their attackers could handle. The possessed soldiers retreated after suffering casualties that would have killed normal humans, but only temporarily dispersed their spiritual parasites. But Kael knew this was just the opening skirmish. As he studied the prophecy stone's revelations, a clearer picture emerged of the threat they faced. Navarro Industries wasn't working alone. They were part of a network of organizations across the country, all dedicated to destroying indigenous sacred sites and breaking the spiritual protections that had safeguarded the land for millennia. The enemy's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. By destroying key nodes in the Guardian networks of different tribes, they would create spiritual dead zones that could be exploited by forces from beyond the natural world. What they were unleashing would make the European conquest look like a minor disagreement between neighbors. As this understanding crystallized, Kael felt the prophecy stone respond to his comprehension. A new symbol blazed to life on its surface. The Wolf Spirit Amulet, a talisman of power that would mark his full acceptance of the guardian role and grant him abilities beyond anything he'd experienced so far. But claiming it would also mean crossing a line from which there could be no return. The amulet materialized as he reached toward the symbol, a piece of carved stone that seemed to contain starlight within its crystalline structure. The moment it touched his skin, Kael felt his consciousness expand beyond his physical body. He could perceive the entire network of sacred sites across the southwest, see the damage that had already been done and the work that still needed to be completed. More importantly, he could sense other guardians awakening, not just Apache, but Navajo, Hopi, and dozens of other tribal protectors who had been dormant for generations. The enemy's assault had awakened something they hadn't anticipated, a coordinated response from every indigenous spiritual tradition in the region. Through his enhanced perception, Kael reached out to these other guardians, sharing what he'd learned about the conspiracy and the true scope of the threat. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across hundreds of miles, ancient protections were stirring to life. Sacred sites that had been dormant for decades began to pulse with renewed power, but the enemy wasn't idle either. Even as the Guardian network awakened, Navarro Industries was accelerating their timeline. Construction crews were working around the clock at a dozen sacred sites, racing to complete their destruction before the spiritual defenses could be fully restored. And behind them came something worse. Teams of specialists who weren't just destroying the sites, but performing rituals designed to corrupt them permanently. SPAC had grown during their time in the canyon. Spirit wolves from across the region had answered the call, creating a supernatural army that numbered in the hundreds. But they would need more than spiritual allies to face what was coming. They would need human supporters who understood the stakes and were willing to fight for something beyond their own immediate interests. The solution came from an unexpected source. As Kael prepared to leave the canyon, his radio crackled with a familiar voice, David Crowfeather, his old hunting partner, speaking in the coded language they'd developed during years of tracking together. "The elders are gathering," David said. "Ayana says the signs can no longer be ignored. Traditional warriors from 6 tribes are prepared to stand with the Wolf Guardian." The meeting took place at a neutral location, a trading post that had served as neutral ground between different Apache bands for over a century. Kael arrived to find not just tribal warriors, but representatives from environmental groups, native rights organizations, and even some federal agents who had grown suspicious of Navarro Industries' methods and financing. Elder Ayana presided over the gathering with the authority of her years and wisdom. The old prophecies spoke of a time when all the indigenous peoples would need to stand together against a common threat, she said. That time has come. The plan they developed was ambitious beyond anything Kael had imagined. Rather than simply defending individual sacred sites, they would coordinate a simultaneous awakening of the entire Guardian network across the American Southwest. Every tribal protector would activate their ancestral defenses at the same moment, creating a web of spiritual power strong enough to repel whatever forces their enemies were trying to unleash. But the plan required precise timing and absolute trust between groups that had sometimes been rivals for centuries. It also required Kael to travel to the most dangerous sacred site of all, the heart of the sacred land. A location so powerful that both the prophecies and the enemy's plans centered around its capture or destruction. The heart lay hidden in the deepest part of a mountain range that straddled the border between Arizona and New Mexico, protected by natural barriers that had kept it secret from all but the most initiated tribal members. According to the prophecy stone, it was the original source of all Guardian power, the place where the first Wolf Guardian had made his pact with the spirit realm. As the meeting concluded, Kael found himself surrounded by volunteers. not just Apache warriors, but fighters from dozens of tribes, all united by the understanding that their fight transcended traditional boundaries. They would create a defensive perimeter around the heart while he performed the final ceremony that would either save the Guardian network or destroy it forever. Dot among the volunteers was someone who surprised him, Jonas Silverbird, the tribal council secretary who had once dismissed the Guardian traditions as outdated folklore. "I was wrong," Jonas admitted. "I've seen what they're really trying to do to our lands. Whatever it takes to stop them, count me in." The transformation was complete when Takoda Whitebear, the war chief who had initially opposed Kael's quest, he knelt before him in the ancient gesture of recognition between warriors. "You carry the fire of our ancestors," Takoda said. "We will follow where you lead." As they prepared for the final confrontation, Kael felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Every guardian who had ever walked this path, every warrior who had ever defended the sacred places, every ancestor who had died protecting their people's spiritual heritage, all of them were present in the power that flowed through the wolf spirit amulet. The enemy had spent generations preparing for this moment, but so had the land itself, and so had the spirits of those who had sworn to protect it. The final battle would determine not just the fate of the sacred sites, but the spiritual future of an entire continent. The heart of the sacred land lay hidden within a circular valley so perfectly formed it seemed carved by divine hands. Ancient petroglyphs covered every rock face, telling the story of the first wolf guardian and the original pact that had created the spiritual protection network. At the center of the valley, a crystalline formation rose from the earth like a natural cathedral, its faceted surfaces reflecting light that seemed to come from within rather than from the sun above. Kael felt the power of the place the moment he entered the valley. This wasn't just another sacred site. It was the source, the heart that pumped spiritual energy through the entire network of guardian locations across the southwest. The wolf spirit amulet at his chest blazed with response, and suddenly he could perceive the true scope of what the first guardians had created centuries ago. But the beauty of the moment shattered as the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. Navarro's forces had found them, and this time they came in overwhelming numbers. Military-style helicopters circled the valley while ground forces moved in from every direction. These weren't just security guards or even regular soldiers. They were specialists trained specifically for this mission, equipped with weapons and gear designed to fight supernatural opponents. "They've been planning this for decades." Q's voice resonated in Kael's mind as the great wolf materialized beside him in his most powerful form yet. Everything else was just preparation for this moment. Through the chaos of approaching enemies, Kael heard the coordinated response of his allies. Takoda's voice crackled over the radio. "Perimeter established. We'll hold them as long as we can, but you need to complete the ceremony now." The ceremony. According to the prophecy stone, awakening, the heart required more than just touching it or reciting ancient words. It required the guardian to offer himself completely to the spirit realm, to become a permanent bridge between the human world and the forces that protected the sacred places. The process would transform him into something beyond human and eternal. Sentinel who could never again live a normal life. As enemy forces repelled into the valley, Kael approached the crystalline formation at its center. The moment his hands touched its surface, he felt the presence of every wolf guardian who had ever lived. They spoke to him in voices like wind through canyon walls, sharing their strength and their understanding of what was required. "The transformation begins," he said aloud, and immediately felt ancient power flowing through his body. The sacred war paint that had appeared during his earlier battles now blazed across his skin with permanent intensity. The wolf spirit amulet fused with his chest, becoming part of his very essence. Around him, the spirit wolves materialized in greater numbers than ever before. not just the pack that had been traveling with him, but the spiritual guardians of every sacred site across the entire network. They formed protective circles around the heart, their forms becoming more solid and menacing as Kael's transformation progressed. The enemy forces opened fire with weapons that seemed designed to wound spiritual beings as well as physical ones. But their bullets passed harmlessly through the spirit wolves, while the Guardians' retaliation took the form of supernatural phenomena that sent the attackers reeling. Lightning struck from clear skies. The ground opened beneath their feet, and spectral wolves materialized to drag the most corrupted soldiers back to whatever realm had originally spawned their parasitic entities. Through it all, Kael continued. His transformation. He could feel his human consciousness expanding, merging with the spiritual essence of the land itself. The heart of the sacred land pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and suddenly he could perceive every sacred site in the network, feel the spiritual health of the entire American Southwest. What he saw filled him with both hope and desperation. The Guardian awakening was working. Sacred sites across hundreds of miles were blazing back to life, their spiritual defenses restored and strengthened. But the corruption was spreading too, flowing out from the sites that had been successfully destroyed or defiled. If it reached critical mass before the network was fully restored, it would poison the spiritual landscape of an entire continent. The crystalline heart responded to his urgency, opening pathways of power he hadn't known existed. Through these channels, Kael sent his consciousness racing across the network, personally awakening sites that had been dormant for generations, pouring his own spiritual energy into places where the old protections had been broken. But each site he restored required more of his human essence. He could feel himself becoming something other than human, his consciousness stretching across vast distances while his physical form became increasingly translucent, more spirit than flesh. The price, Q's voice carried infinite sadness as the great wolf padded to his side. This is the price all guardians must pay to protect what they love most. Around them, the battle raged as tribal warriors fought alongside spirit wolves against enemies that were no longer entirely human. The tide was turning, but slowly, and Kael realized that his transformation alone wouldn't be enough. The heart had more power to give, but claiming it would mean crossing the final threshold from human guardian to eternal protector. As enemy reinforcements poured into the valley, Kael made his choice. He pressed deeper into the crystalline formation, feeling it merge with his very soul. The transformation was no longer partial, it was complete and permanent. The Wolf Guardian had awakened, and the real battle for the sacred places was about to begin. The transformation reached its climax as dawn broke over the valley. Kael's human form dissolved into pure spiritual energy, then reconstituted itself as something far more powerful, a being that existed simultaneously in the physical world and the spirit realm. His connection to every sacred site in the network was now absolute, allowing him to channel power beyond anything the original Guardians had possessed. But his enemies had prepared for this moment too, as the sun rose, revealing the full scope of the battle raging around the heart. Kael saw that Navarro Industries had brought more than just military equipment. They had transported massive drilling rigs into the valley, machines designed not just to destroy the crystalline formation, but to extract its spiritual essence and redirect it toward their own purposes. They don't just want to break the network, Kael realized with growing horror. They want to steal its power and use it for themselves. The drilling operation was being overseen by the man himself, Marcus Navarro, descendant of conquistadors and heir to centuries of hatred for everything the indigenous peoples represented. Through his enhanced perceptions, Kael could see the spiritual corruption that had consumed the man over decades of serving entities from beyond the natural world. Navarro's plan was diabolical in its cleverness. Rather than simply destroying, The sacred sites he intended to reverse their function, turning them from sources of protection into conduits for invasion. The beings he served, ancient predators from realms where life and death held different meanings, would use the corrupted network to manifest physically in the American Southwest, beginning a conquest that would eventually spread across the entire continent. But Navarro had underestimated the power of the fully awakened network. As Kael channeled energy through the restored connections between sacred sites, the land itself began to fight back. Earthquakes split the ground beneath the drilling rigs, while geysers of superheated water erupted from depths that shouldn't have existed in the desert. The spirit wolves, now numbering in the thousands as guardians from across centuries, joined the battle, attacked with supernatural ferocity. They flowed through the enemy ranks like liquid moonlight, their spiritual forms immune to conventional weapons, while their claws and fangs proved devastatingly effective against the corrupted soldiers. At the center of it all, Kael had undergone his own transformation. No longer just a spirit wolf, he had become something approaching a divine avatar, a creature of pure protective instinct standing nearly 10 feet tall, his form wreathed in silver fire that burned away any corruption it touched. The moment of choice comes. Kael's voice resonated not just in Kael's mind, but throughout the entire valley. The heart can be preserved, but only at the ultimate cost. Kael understood. To permanently protect the heart and ensure the network could never be corrupted, he would need to merge completely with the crystalline formation, becoming its eternal guardian. His human life would end, but his spirit would become part of the land itself, an immortal protector that no enemy could destroy or corrupt. The decision became urgent as Navarro's drilling equipment finally breached the outer layers of the heart. Spiritual energy began bleeding from the wound, and Kael felt the entire network shudder as its primary source was compromised. If the corruption reached the heart's core, the resulting explosion of perverted power would destroy not just the Guardian network, but every sacred site within 1,000 miles. Kael made his choice without hesitation. He stepped forward into the heart itself, feeling his consciousness merge with the crystalline matrix that had channeled spiritual power for centuries. The process was agonizing and ecstatic simultaneously. Every memory, every experience, every relationship from his human life burning away as he became something eternal and beyond mortality. But as he transformed, Kael felt an unexpected presence joining him within the heart. Kael had chosen to make the same sacrifice, the great wolf spirit merging with his guardians to create something neither had been alone, a perfect fusion of human wisdom and wolf instinct, of spiritual power and protective fury. Their combined essence exploded outward from the heart in waves of purifying energy that washed across the entire network. Sacred sites that had been dormant for generations blazed back to life, while the corrupted locations were cleansed of the spiritual poison that had infected them. The effect on Navarro's forces was instantaneous and devastating. The possessed soldiers simply ceased to exist as the entities controlling them were banished back to whatever realm had spawned them. The drilling equipment melted into slag as temperatures that existed only in the spiritual realm manifested briefly in the physical world. Navarro himself, faced with the failure of his generational mission, made one final desperate attempt to complete his work. Drawing a knife carved with symbols that hurt to look at, he lunged toward the heart's core, intending to corrupt it with his own blood and the entities that had consumed his family line. He never reached his target. The combined spirit of Kael and Kael rose from the heart like an avenging angel, their merged consciousness wielding power that had accumulated over centuries of protection and devotion. Navarro's corruption was burned away in an instant, leaving only a confused old man who collapsed weeping as he remembered what he had truly been doing with his life. 6 months after the battle at the heart of the sacred land, the American Southwest had become a different place. The restored Guardian network hummed with protective energy that could be felt by anyone sensitive to the spiritual currents of the land. Sacred sites that had been dormant for generations were now pilgrimage destinations where people of all backgrounds came to experience something beyond the material world. The legal aftermath had been surprisingly straightforward, with Marcus Navarro in federal custody and his companies under investigation for fraud, environmental crimes, and connections to international criminal organizations. The corrupted development projects were shut down permanently. The sacred sites were granted protection under expanded interpretations of religious freedom laws, ensuring they would remain safe for future generations. But the most profound changes were happening within the tribal communities themselves. The awakening of the Guardian network had sparked a renaissance of traditional knowledge and spiritual practice that was spreading far beyond the boundaries of the Southwest. Elders who had seen their cultures slowly eroding found themselves training dozens of young people, eager to learn the old ways. Elder Ayana sat in her traditional chair in the tribal council building, but the meetings she now presided over bore little resemblance to the desperate gatherings of 6 months ago. Representatives from dozens of tribes came seeking guidance on awakening their own guardian traditions. Environmental groups wanted to understand how spiritual protection could complement legal safeguards. Even federal officials arrived regularly, asking for consultation on sacred site preservation. The world is remembering what it forgot, Ayana told the latest group of visitors. But remembering is only the first step. Living according to that knowledge, that's the real work. The new tribal charter she held in her weathered hands represented something unprecedented in modern American history. It formally incorporated the Guardian traditions into tribal governance, creating legal frameworks for spiritual protection that bridged ancient wisdom and contemporary law. Similar documents were being drafted by indigenous communities across the continent as word of the Apache experience spread. Takoda Whitebear, now serving as the director of Sacred Site Protection, oversaw a training program that was producing a new generation of guardians. Not all would develop the deep spiritual connections that Kael had possessed, but each learned to read the signs that indicated threats to sacred places and to coordinate responses across tribal boundaries. The Wolf Guardian showed us that the old divisions between tribes matter less than our shared responsibility to the land, Dakota explained to a group of young Apache warriors beginning their training. When the sacred places are threatened, we are all one people. The training took place at a new facility built near the original cave, where Kael had first discovered the ancient paintings. The cave itself had become a shrine where visitors could still feel the presence of the merged spirits of Kael and Kiyu. On quiet mornings, some claimed to see a figure walking among the petroglyphs, sometimes appearing human, sometimes wolf-like, always radiating the calm authority of an eternal protector. Nayeli Tahoma had become the keeper of her husband's memory and the primary interpreter of his transformation for those struggling to understand what had happened. She found peace in helping others comprehend that Kael's sacrifice had been a choice made from love, not loss. He didn't die, she would tell visitors to the shrine. He became something more than human, more than mortal. When I bring our daughters, here they can feel him watching over them, protecting not just them, but all the children who will grow up in a world where the sacred places are safe again. The twins, now 10 years old, had inherited enough of their father's sensitivity to serve as bridges between the human community and the spiritual realm that Kael now inhabited. They often claimed to receive messages from him, guidance about weather patterns, warnings about potential threats, reassurances that the network remained strong and vigilant. David Crow Feather had taken over many of Kael's former responsibilities as a hunter and tracker, but he also served as the primary liaison between the Apache Guardian program and similar efforts developing among other tribes. His reports painted a picture of spiritual awakening spreading across indigenous communities throughout North America. "It's not just the Southwest anymore," he told the council during his latest briefing. "Tribes in the Pacific Northwest are reporting the return of their own guardian spirits. The Plains nations are seeing the awakening of buffalo spirit protectors. Even the eastern woodlands tribes are finding that their sacred groves are coming back to life after centuries of dormancy." Jonas Silverbird, once a skeptic of the guardian traditions, now managed the complex legal and political frameworks required to maintain protection for the growing network of active sacred sites. His transformation from pragmatist to believer had been complete and permanent. "The spirits work through law as much as through ceremony," he observed. "Kael taught us that protecting the sacred places requires every tool available: traditional knowledge, legal expertise, political advocacy, and spiritual power working together." As the first anniversary of the Heart's Awakening approached, preparations were underway for a ceremony unlike any in recorded Apache history. Representatives from every tribe that had participated in the Guardian Network's restoration would gather to honor Kael's sacrifice and renew their commitment to protecting the sacred places. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening in the everyday lives of people throughout the region. Children grew up with a deeper connection to the land, instinctively understanding the difference between places that were merely beautiful and those that were truly sacred. Adults found themselves drawn to outdoor meditation and ceremonies that their grandparents would have recognized, even if they had never been taught the specific traditions. The Guardian Network had become more than a system of spiritual protection. It was a living bridge between ancient wisdom and modern challenges, proof that the deepest truths about humanity's relationship with the natural world were not lost, but simply waiting for the right moment to return. On a clear morning in late autumn, a young Apache girl named Ayana, named for the elder who had guided Kael's early steps on the Guardian path, was walking near the memorial cave when she saw something that made her heart race with wonder. A young wolf, silver-furred and intelligent-eyed, stepped out from behind the rocks and looked at her with the same recognition that Kael had seen in Kiu's gaze so many months ago. The cycle was beginning again, as it always had and always would. Because some truths are too important to be lost forever, the Guardians would continue their eternal watch, and the sacred places would endure, protected by the unbreakable bond between human hearts and the spirits of the wild.